Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next Resilience Research podcast series. In this series, we will be talking about measures of resilience. So before we begin the discussion, it'd be great if we could all introduce ourselves to the audience. So a brief introduction of your name, your occupation, and your field. So for example, hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer McGowan. I'm a lecturer at UCL, and my field is in health psychology.
My name is Elyan Aarts. I am a research master student at Maastricht University, but I'm currently on a placement at Queen's University where we work on a study in resilience and we use EMA for this.
Fantastic, thank you. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your research more generally before we start the discussion? So just for an audience who are not themselves scientists, sort of explain what you do and why you do it.
Great. Yes. So we are trying to look into mechanisms that underlie resilience. So I think the most general way of defining resilience is the ability to bounce back after adversity, but we're not very clear on why certain people are able to do this while others struggle a bit more and go on to develop maybe PTSD or depression or anxiety. So what we are trying to do is to find these factors, maybe characteristics of ways in which people cope that help them to stay healthy.
Sounds really important.
Yes, absolutely. It can be used to train people to and we hope, of course, to find interventions that will help people to, in the end, not develop PTSD after they experience a traumatic event, and maybe even teach children already how to cope with their emotions or stressors, and that will, help them to stay healthy throughout their life.
So your measure's not just for identifying whether someone has resilience, but you're also hoping to use it to train people as well?
Eventually, we do hope to do that, yes. But the study we're working on right now is mainly, the basic of it.
Excellent. So talking about the field of measures of resilience in particular, some people might be thinking this is kind of a weird thing to have a podcast on because surely we know how we measure resilience. But as people in the field, we know there is a huge number of different measures of resilience. And I was wondering from your perspective, but why do you think there are so many different measures?
I think there are so many different measures because we're not exactly clear yet on what resilience is or what it entails. If you don't even have a clear consensus on what the definition of resilience is, then how are you going to measure the exact one thing with just usually one questionnaire? So we have multiple questionnaires at the moment measuring different factors, for example, support, family support, emotional support, things like how you cope with stress, how you deal with your emotions, but also just general ability to bounce back. And we have, I think, 3 main questionnaires at the moment that measure this. But even so, if we look at these factors that at the moment we correlate to resilience, we still can't predict who will become resilient and who will not. So again, going back to how we want to train resilience in people, then eventually we don't know what exactly it is then that we should what we should focus on. So that's why I think the measures at the moment just measure a whole lot of different things, and we're not exactly clear yet on what exactly is the resilience part of this.
Yeah, and in our previous podcast, we've identified people defining resilience as an individual trait, as something to do with society, as something that almost everyone has or very few people have, as you say, as bouncing back or as doing better than before even. How would you define resilience?
I think for me, what the definition that we use in our lab at the moment is the bouncing back from adversity in the way that people can still function, so not develop psychopathology after, mainly as in that they're not blocked in what they did before and can just continue to be as healthy, not necessarily better, but definitely as healthy, and they can still maintain their job, their relationships, and all that.
So you're looking at people's ability to not end up with a clinical sort of illness after any specific event or a specifically traumatic one?
We would say mainly, potentially traumatic events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you've mentioned that there are some very common measures of resilience. And I mean, ones that I know that are used very commonly are the CD risk, or the resilience scale 14, or the brief resilience scale. Everybody loves because it's only 6 items long, so it's really quick and
Yes.
easy to do. But your group's coming up with their own measure. So I'd like to ask, if you don't mind telling me, on something that will be recorded on air, what is it about the measures that currently exist that you feel are not appropriately identifying resilience?
So we feel that the measures that are used at the moment, you only administer them usually once, or if it's a longitudinal design, you will give it to them maybe once a year for the next 5 years, but you still only get a very brief momentary view on how this person is doing in that moment or how they're coping. And we see a lot of variability within a person. So a person does not always behave or think or feel the same way, and this already fluctuates within a day, maybe even in a week. So if a person knows how to deal with a certain stressful event, does that mean how they know how to cope with a traumatic event or different traumatic events? And we feel that, yeah, at the moment, these resilience skills that we're using, first of all, it also only gives the view of the person itself, right? So you can think, okay, I know very well how to deal with this stressor in my life. That must mean I will also be able to deal if it's a very traumatic event that happens to me. And you'll get a high resilience score because that is what you believe. Well, maybe if you do go through something very traumatic, you know, that's the whole thing with us already struggling to predict it. So how is a person themselves going to predict this very well? So we think that by using EMA, which of course it's more for daily stressors because we can't give a person a questionnaire every single day for the rest of their lives, but at least we can see how they deal with everyday stressors and how this helps them to maintain a stable level of emotions and relationships.
Okay, so your measure's sort of looking at like a range of everyday stresses, and you're hoping to use that to identify resilience across all sort of different kinds of events. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and that's a really fluid definition as well. And one thing a lot of people have previously complained about in our podcast about resilience is that it is seen as a static thing. And of course it isn't. As you say, just because you're doing okay in one thing doesn't mean you'll be okay in another. It does change, but that must be really hard to measure because there's so many different things people can be exposed to in their lifetimes. How are you hoping to cope with that?
Exactly. No, that's a very good question. So for now, we're just looking within a week of a person's life. So if you're not as familiar with EMA, maybe I should just briefly talk about that a little bit. So what we do is people download an app on their phone. They get notifications 5 times a day for the next 7 days. And those 5 times a day, so it's every 3 hours, they receive a short questionnaire of about 5 minutes where they answer questions about their mood. So are you happy at the moment? Are you excited? Are you sad? And then we also look at whether or not a stressful event happened in their life. And so this is how we're trying to look at this now, is just to see if someone has a conflict compared to they experience a deadline at work. Are they just as well able to deal with both of these different events within these 7 days? So of course, it's still not perfect because like I said, we can't unfortunately measure a person for this long, for this intensive amount of time for a year, which would be ideal. But yeah, so for now, we're just dealing with this in a shorter, intense time frame.
Yeah, so 5 times a day for a week, that is very intense. And as you say,
Yes,
very hard to scale up. Did you
absolutely.
you're calling it the EMA, is that right?
Yes,
What does that stand for?
it stands for Ecological Momentary Assessment.
Okay, and that's what you're hoping to do for resilience, have a momentary assessment of it.
Exactly, yes.
Fantastic. So do you want to talk to me more about how you came up with that idea?
Yeah, so it was mainly influenced by a paper published by George Bonanno called The Resilience Paradox, in which he mentions some flaws that we see in the self-report questionnaires, and especially not being able to measure within person variability with them. And so we started thinking about how then we would define resilience, which we decided to go with his definition of a flexibility mindset and a flexible way of coping with stressors in life, and not necessarily as a personality trait. And so, yeah, based on that, we then decided, but how can we measure flexibility then if we can't use these very well-known and validated questionnaires? And then the idea we came up with was to use EMA.
Fantastic. And you've mentioned flexibility there.
Yes.
And the design that you have clearly has a lot of flexibility in it. How do you hope to scale that up into a measure that can be used more widely?
That is a very good question. So we're not sure if we will be able to create just one questionnaire and then ask these similar questions, because most of the questions that we use for the EMA are taken from these more well-known measures about emotion regulation flexibility or coping flexibility, the affective skills. So we still end up with just a mixture of these well-known skills, but because we measure them multiple times a day, it makes it more flexible. So if people could continue doing that and use EMA for that, maybe only 2 times a day, which already makes it a bit more manageable for a person, get a broader view of how they're coping. Maybe it could even be used in therapy sessions, specifically looking at a person and how they cope and what could we work on in terms of flexibility and emotion regulation here. And really focus on that for an individual person. I think it would be very difficult to just take this one thing that we have now as EMA and just say, this is going to be how we'll measure resilience forever. I think that's very difficult thing to say, but it can be adapted. And I hope that, based on what we do now, it will be easier for us to determine what the correct way or an easier way of studying resilience would be.
So it's going to be a very tailored scale to each individual, because you're looking at how they sort of deal with something at a baseline and how that changes over time, and depending on what they experience in their lives. And presumably they tell you what they experience as they go along. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. We really asked them what that stressful event in their life was, how upset they were by it as well, because we do think that something that can be considered stressful for one person does not necessarily have to be stressful for another person. So it's really also about how they respond to it. But we do ask them to still measure if they had a deadline, even if they didn't think it was as stressful, to please still mention it to us, because of course that would help us to see if they deal with it in a certain way. Would that also be helpful for another person? Would they then not experience these deadlines as being as stressful anymore?
Fantastic. And you've mentioned you want to use it with children. Is it aimed at children at this point in time, or is that just a hope for the future?
At this point, that is just a hope for the future, yes.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to more specifics about your scale. So you've mentioned that you define resilience as the ability to bounce back.
Yes.
And you've mentioned that you're measuring resilience in relation to flexibility. And I think you've also mentioned emotional regulation and coping.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you consider important when measuring resilience?
Yes, so we also do still look at certain characteristics, like how optimistic a person can be. Do they have a certain mindset that will help them? So a growth mindset, pretty much. So do they see a challenge as something they can learn from and grow from here, or do they feel like it's something that they're just stuck in and they can't do anything with it? So we are still looking kind of at traits or like a mindset that a person has, which I feel is also important in resilience, next to, as you said, the emotion regulation and the coping flexibility. And we also look at just their emotions in general. But again, it's EMA, we had to keep it quite brief, so we had to really pick and choose what our main focus is going to be on. So I feel like these 3, based on George Bonanno's research, have been the ones that, we chose for this.
Excellent. It sounds really helpful. So recently we've been focusing a lot on societal level resilience, and one of the reasons people have been saying that's an important thing to do is because individual resilience, we don't know what it is, we don't know how it exists, and it is so flexible from one person to another. So it's really great to hear about this scale that you're coming up with that is going to be flexible, that's going to be individual level support, but also can be directly used to improve people's resilience as well. So that's a huge achievement on you just for getting this far.
Thank you. Yes, we really do hope that we get some really good results out of this that will be very beneficial for sure.
Okay, I have a question that you've put in the form, and thank you very much for providing this question. I just want to confirm, I'm going to ask it sort of officially in a second, but I just want to confirm whether you still feel you have an answer to it or whether you feel like we've in fact covered it up to this point. So you asked why EMA would be an effective measure to study resilience. Are you happy for me to still ask that question?
I think we've discussed that. Right. Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay, anything we haven't covered that you think it's important for people to know about your scale?
I think. No, I feel like this was a really good discussion of it.
Well, you gave great answers. You're really thorough and you definitely, you know your stuff. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear.
What I'm going to suggest then, we did have, and this does happen sometimes, we did have 10 people sign up today. And
Okay.
for one reason or another, none of them have managed to make it. So what I'm going to do is try and rearrange the Measures podcast to try and get just a few more people to come in and discuss. What I'd like to do with this recording is provide it to you to use as you would like, as just an interview of you. So if you'd like it on your website for your university, you could do that. If you do Twitter or whatever, welcome to use it however you like to make yourself more well known and let people know about your scale. And we'll try and get a wider group of people to do just a little bit longer podcast in the future. Does that sound okay to you?
That sounds good, yes.
Okay, well, thank you again for being here. And it was really great to hear from you and a really interesting study. Really look forward to hearing how that all goes.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you for having me.
Okay, then I will let you go there, but thank you very much for being here today.
Have a good day.
You too.